First, how can the injustice of persecution justify some sort of soteriological pluralism? And second, what sort of soteriological pluralism may be justified in this way? Let's consider the second question first. In order to remove the cause of persecution, it's not necessary to hold that those of all religious persuasions have an equal shot at any given post-mortem fate. It would seem sufficient to avoid blanket damnations on the basis of denomination. What's important in this regard is not specific to the belief in eternal damnation. It's sufficient for there to be belief that some cosmic law or divine judgment makes the members of one group despicable, sets them up in the eyes of others as a potential scapegoat, and stigmatizes them. So the minimal sort of pluralism needed to avoid persecution would be one that holds that among the major religions, all have the value of being free from stigma, either equally or above some threshold sufficient to remove the danger of persecution. Let's call this astigmatic pluralism, for astigmatic meaning removing the stigma, and its denial, religious stigmatism. One may hold that the rejection of one's faith is a damnable sin, while maintaining astigmatic pluralism, for example, through an emphasis on God's love of sinners. One might also hold that God has commanded us to be kind and tolerant toward those who reject the true religion, perhaps in hopes that they will repent and thereby avoid damnation. As for the first question, we should now consider how an argument could be formulated for astigmatic pluralism based on the idea that religious stigmatism leads to persecution. Consider the following argument. 1. If a belief leads to injustice, such belief should be condemned and rejected. 2. Belief in religious stigmatism leads to injustice. 3. Thus, belief in religious stigmatism should be condemned and rejected. Not everyone will be convinced by this sort of argument, despite the fact that the argument is not that astigmatic pluralism is true, but only that it is morally objectionable to think that it's not. Those unconvinced by the argument might attack premise 1 by saying that a belief should be condemned and rejected only if it's false, regardless of whether it leads to injustice. They might also take issue with the notion that a true belief might lead to injustice. Consider one who believes in caste differences. Such a person might be presented with the following argument. 4. If a belief leads to injustice, such belief should be condemned and rejected. 5. Belief in caste differences leads to injustice. 6. Thus, belief in caste differences should be condemned and rejected. In response, we should expect from the believer in caste differences is that what should be condemned is not the belief, but the use of this belief as an excuse for injustice. Likewise, the believer in religious stigmatism might argue that even though the members of groups of others are damned, they should not be mistreated. Although a defense of religious stigmatism might be mounted along these lines, the view conflicts with widespread current moral and social norms, according to which it's repugnant to make claims about eternal damnation due solely to religious affiliation, at least with regard to what are considered normal denominations within the major traditions. Aside from the issue of social stigmatism, there are also other philosophical arguments that can be given against the view that God may damn the adherents of a given belief system for no other reason than their adherence. Usually, the view that membership in the wrong denomination is sufficient for eternal damnation is coupled with the belief that the preferred denomination contains the sole means to escape damnation. Exclusivist Jews and Muslims, for example, might hold that the only way to escape damnation is by following the Torah or Sharia, respectively. The exclusivist Christian might hold that all are damned who do not accept Jesus, peace be with him, as their personal Savior. It might be helpful to consider the negative side of soteriological pluralism. Instead of concentrating on the claim that only one way leads to salvation, consider the claim that all other ways lead to perdition. One need not be a pluralist of any stripe to deny this. Atheists deny that God sends people to hell on the basis of religious affiliation, since by definition they deny that there's a God at all. Although some atheists seem to think that any sort of religious belief is damning in some sense. What is crucial to note regarding the issue of religious exclusivism with respect to salvation is that there are lots of people who deny soteriological exclusivism without accepting religious pluralism or religious inclusivism. Some might deny exclusivism because they do not believe in God, others because they do not believe in heaven and hell, and others because they believe that special acts of divine grace may save people in otherwise damnable denominations. Soteriological religious exclusivism may be formulated in several ways, depending upon whether the factor that causes others to be damned is taken to be their beliefs, their practices, or their affiliation. The most extreme form of soteriological religious exclusivism would hold that all those whose beliefs, practices, or affiliations are not those of the favored group are damned. This view may be attacked on theological and philosophical grounds. Theologians usually make exceptions for those who lack the mental or physical capacities to consciously affiliate, believe, or practice according to some set of teachings. Why are these exceptions made? The exclusivist might hold that since God is just, he would not punish someone for something that they could not do anything about. According to the religious rejection of soteriological exclusivism, one argues on the basis of religious beliefs about the justice and mercy of God to the conclusion that God would not cast people into eternal perdition for picking what the arguer considers the wrong denomination, especially given the fact that denominational affiliation is highly correlated with accidents of birth. The philosophical rejection of soteriological exclusivism has a different structure, for it's not based on any religious beliefs at all. The idea is that soteriological exclusivism leads to inconsistency. The argument is that the following three propositions form an inconsistent triad. 1, God is perfectly good. 2, God is omnipotent. And 3, for all persons S, if S deviates from the right beliefs, practices, or religious affiliation, then God condemns S to eternal damnation. It's argued that these three propositions are inconsistent, so at least one must be abandoned. Abandoning either of the first two would be to give up belief in the existence of God. But to abandon 3' is also to reject soteriological exclusivism. Hence, soteriological exclusivism is untenable. The argument is not watertight, however, for the soteriological exclusivist could always insist that divine goodness would not be compromised by condemning people who in good conscience fail to accept the right beliefs, practices, or affiliation. Here we might respond that even if 1, 2, and 3' are not logically inconsistent, it is not very plausible to consider all of them true. The implausibility of the claim that an omnibenevolent God would condemn people to eternal damnation solely because of denominational deviance is often supported by the argument that denominational variation is largely determined by accidents of birth, such as the region in which one was born and raised, and it would be unjust for anyone to be condemned because of accidents of birth. Another argument is that it would be wrong for God to punish those who fail to obey a command that had not reached them, or a command that they were unable to understand. Assuming that God commands all people to join a particular denomination, it seems that there are many people who have failed to understand that God has issued this command. Hence, it would be wrong for God to issue damnations solely on the basis of denominational affiliation. In conclusion, astigmatic pluralism may be defended for philosophical reasons. For example, religious stigmatism is contrary to wide accepted moral norms, and astigmatic pluralism implies the rejection of soteriological exclusivism. Soteriological exclusivism may also be rejected by an argument analogous to the argument of evil, and for theological reasons as well. That is, the loving and merciful God would not condemn people to eternal damnation merely because they were adherents of the wrong religion. If you have any questions, I'll entertain questions, then we'll take a break, then we'll come back and I'll discuss religious truth and religious dialogue.
Sorry,
thank you for your talk. It's good because you're bringing out in the open what is usually kept in the background about this dilemma of salvation. And I've been asked about it before by people as well. And I don't know, there do seem to be kind of, I suppose, grades of salvation. I mean, I know Holy Quran says it's God who will judge between the people, and that non-Muslims will have their reward, and there are those kinds of, and I know even some mystics say there are different grades of heaven or different heavens for different types of believers as well. I think one of the problems with the issue of salvation is that human beings are not, it's like they're not very subtle in the way they think. I think where we end up in the afterlife is a very, very subtle and delicate matter, and we're trying to kind of judge it in a very clumsy way. I was just interested about when you said, for example, with regard to this issue of salvation, because I wrote something once on the cult of Osiris in Egypt, which it came just before the emergence of Christianity, about 300 years, 400 years before Christianity, and or longer before that. And it was quite interesting to see this transformation in the religious trends in Egypt, moving from the cult of Ra, the solar god, where it would be only the elite who would embark on his ship and go across the solar system. And suddenly, for some reason, I think with the decline of the pharaohs and the breakup of the rulership in Egypt, there arose the cult of Osiris, which is almost identical to the cult of Christianity. I mean, I shouldn't call it a cult, but I mean, it's identical. There are many doctrines that are identical. Osiris is a very Christ-like figure, whereas before with Ra, salvation depended upon social status and making offerings, to deities or to Ra. Osiris introduced, this an ethical means to salvation. First of all, it introduced the idea of salvation, and that we need salvation. And secondly, that the way to salvation is through purification and ethical practice. And there is even this idea of takhalluq, taking on the attributes of God, because the aim of those who followed Osiris was to become an Osiris, to take on the attributes of Osiris, and to be you could be in the company of Osiris by taking on Osiris-like attributes. So I don't know whether, this seems to be a bit of a kind of maybe non-religious way at looking at the issue of salvation, but I wonder whether this whole idea of salvation, I have a question mark over how it came about, in a way, in terms of human history.
Yeah. Thank you. That's interesting comment. And I also find this image of crossing over by a ferry or something like this to be something really interesting that you find in lots of different kind of religious traditions. And it's like there's the people left on one side, and then there's the ones who cross over. And then the question happens, once you cross over to the other side, what happens? Is there a further journey to be made? And you're right to point out also that oftentimes something that's emphasized more in the mystical traditions is the idea that there's lots and lots of degrees or stages. So it's not just you're either up or down, you're saved or you're damned, but there's lots of degrees that can be considered. And this is part of accepted theological tradition. Most Christian and Muslim views about afterlife, they allow for there being some differences in degree of how close you can approach to God or things like this. So it's not only in the mystics that you have recognition of these degrees. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Now I want to talk a little bit about religious truth and religious dialogue. The issues of truth and salvation are not independent. According to traditional Christian belief, one is saved through the redemption when one has faith in it, and that implies knowing some things that Christians consider to be very basic truths. Muslims also hold that there are some basic truths about the prophetic mission of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that should be known so that one may find the way to God and keep his laws. There's also a fundamental relation between truth and the attainment of one's goals, between theoretical and practical reasoning. Practical reason serves two basic functions: recognition of goals and finding the way to achieve them. The effective performance of both these functions depends on theoretical reasoning. Even the purely instrumental reasoning of how to get from point A to B requires some rudimentary theoretical knowledge of geometry. If two people differ about theoretical issues concerning where they should go and what is the best way to get there, there's no a priori reason to think that they both have an equal shot at reaching their goals. Differences about truth claims are thus related to expectations about destiny. If two people both believe that it's possible to do things that will have dire consequences in the afterlife, but they differ about what actions have what consequences, they can be expected to disagree over what sorts of life will lead to wretchedness. Not every difference, however, will yield a disagreement. Theoretical differences may be divided initially into two categories. There's disagreement, where one tradition denies what the other one affirms. B, there's complementarity, where one tradition affirms or denies a proposition that has not been affirmed or denied by the other tradition. Consider, for example, the issue of alcohol. Muslims generally consider it to be forbidden in the Quran, and that the prohibition was given gradually. First, requiring sobriety only for those who are saying prayers, and finally making alcoholic beverages haram in essence. Muslims also tend to think that alcohol is bad for you. That is, it's harmful. It has harmful consequences in this life and in the next. Many, although not all Christians, on the other hand, believe that there's nothing wrong with moderate drinking. That is, that it does not have harmful consequences in this life or the afterlife. Evangelical Christians, however, were at the forefront of the prohibition movement at the beginning of the 20th century. So the issue is not simply that Muslims deny what Christians affirm. Nevertheless, the claim that God has forbidden the consumption of alcohol is one that most Muslims would affirm and that many Christians would deny. Here I'm talking about in moderation. There are many other claims that most Muslims affirm and to which some Christians concur. For example, that drinking has harmful effects in this life and the next. Sometimes a belief is held by one group while the other group has no opinion on it, or considers the issue to be outside the range of religious thinking, or they simply don't have information about it. Of course, there are common truths that are accepted both by Christians and Muslims too. But the very important points of contention are what pose the greatest challenge to a pluralistic position with regard to truth claims. The points of contention become obstacles to dialogue in two ways. First, they're made the exclusive focus of attention, and second, they're slighted as mere details. Non-reductive versions of religious pluralism may provide a way for Muslims, Christians, and other participants in religious dialogue to acknowledge that points of difference, complementary and contentious, may play an essential and valuable role in the religious life of members of different communities, beyond the common points that they share. A good example of this was in the question-answer period yesterday. I was asked about the energies in the Orthodox tradition, and I had no idea and was going off on the wrong tangent and things like this. And this is an area in which I don't know whether there's a contradiction with Islamic views or complementarity. It's an area in which there needs to be, at least from my perspective, more exploration of the ideas. Scholars of religious studies interested in the issues of religious pluralism might do well to consult with their colleagues in other departments about sectarian divisions in the fields other than religion. Consider, for example, the logicians. I only picked the example of logicians because I used to teach logic. Although essentially the same points could be made with reference to other fields like physics or economics or something. They're divided into affiliations that rival those of different religious denominations. There are intuitionists, logicists, formalists, conventionalists, dialethists, pluralists, and many other schools of thought among logicians. The adherents of these schools differ from one another about what logic is, how it should be studied, and what valid results have been proven in the field. Even the logical pluralists do not grant that there is truth in equal measure in all the different logical sects. And they're particularly